This is chapter 2 of Silvia Federici, Italian Marxist feminist book, Caliban and the Witch, Women, the Body, and Primitive Accumulation. The chapter is called The Accumulation of Labor and the Degradation of Women, constructing, quote, difference in the, quote, transition to capitalism, end quote. The chapter begins with two epigraphs. The first is from Gerard Winstanley, 1649, The New Law of Righteousness. I demand whether all wars, bloodshed, and misery came not upon the creation when one man endeavored to be a lord over another, and whether this misery shall not remove when all the branches of mankind shall look upon the earth as one common treasury to all. The second is from a book by Barbara Amelade called Heart of Darkness, 1983. To him, she was a fragmented commodity whose feelings and choices were rarely considered. Her head and her heart were separated from her back and her hands and divided from her womb and vagina. Her back and muscle were pressed into field labor. Her hands were demanded to nurse and nurture the white man. Her vagina, used for his sexual pleasure, was the gateway to the womb, which was his place of capital investment. The capital investment being the sex act and the resulting child, the accumulated surplus. Part 1, Introduction. The development of capitalism was not the only possible response to the crisis of feudal power. Throughout Europe, vast communalistic social movements and rebellions against feudalism had offered the promise of a new egalitarian society built on social equality and cooperation. However, by 1525, their most powerful expression, the Peasant War in Germany, or as Peter Blickel called it, the Revolution of the Common Man, was crushed. 100,000 rebels were massacred in retaliation. Then in 1535, New Jerusalem, the attempt made by the Anabaptists in the town of Münster to bring the kingdom of God to earth, also ended in a bloodbath. First undermined presumably by the patriarchal turn taken by its leaders, who by imposing polygamy caused women among their ranks to revolt. With these defeats, compounded by the spreads of witch hunts and the effects of colonial expansion, the revolutionary process in Europe came to an end. Military might was not sufficient, however, to avert the crisis of feudalism. By the late Middle Ages, the feudal economy was doomed, faced with an accumulation crisis that stretched for more than a century. We deduce its dimension from some basic estimates indicating that between 1350 and 1500, a major shift occurred in the power relation between workers and masters. The real wage increased by 100%, prices declined by 33%, rents also declined, the length of the working day decreased, and a tendency appeared toward local self-sufficiency. Evidence of a chronic disaccumulation trend in this period is also found in the pessimism of the contemporary merchants and landowners, and the measures which the European states adopted to protect markets, suppress competition, and force people to work at the conditions imposed. As the entries in the registers of the feudal manors recorded, the work was not worth the breakfast. The feudal economy could not reproduce itself, nor could a capitalist society have, quote, evolved, close quote, from it, for self-sufficiency and the new high-wage regime allowed for the wealth of the people, but, quote, excluded the possibility of capitalistic wealth. That's from Marx. It was in response to this crisis that the European ruling class launched the global offensive that in the course of at least 3 centuries was to change the history of the planet, laying the foundations of a capitalist world system in the relentless attempt to appropriate new sources of wealth, expand its economic basis, and bring new workers under its command. As we know, quote, conquest, enslavement, robbery, murder, in brief, force were the pillars of this process. It's also Marx. Thus, the concept of a, quote, transition to capitalism is in many ways a fiction. British historians in the 1940s and 50s used it to define a period, roughly from 1450 to 1650, in which feudalism in Europe was breaking down while no new socio-economic system was yet in place, though elements of a capitalist society were taking shape. The concept of transition, then, helps us to think of a prolonged process of change and of societies in which capitalist accumulation coexisted with political formations not yet predominantly capitalistic. The term, however, suggests a gradual, linear historical development, whereas the period it names was among the bloodiest and most discontinuous in world history, one that saw apocalyptic transformations and which historians can only describe in the harshest terms: the Iron Age, the Age of Plunder, and the Age of the Whip. Transition, then, cannot evoke the changes that pave the way to the advent of capitalism and the forces that shape them. In this volume, therefore, I use the term primarily in the temporal sense, while I refer to the social processes that characterize the, quote, feudal reaction and the development of capitalist relations with the Marxian concept of primitive accumulation, though I agree with its critics that we must rethink Marx's interpretation of it. Marx introduced the concept of primitive accumulation at the end of Capital Volume 1 to describe the social and economic restructuring that the European ruling class initiated in response to its accumulation crisis, and to establish, in polemics with Adam Smith, that 1, capitalism could not have developed without a prior concentration of capital and labor, and that 2, the divorcing of the workers from the means of production, not the abstinence of the rich, is the source of capitalist wealth. Primitive accumulation, then, is a useful concept, for it connects the, quote, feudal reaction, close quote, with the development of a capitalist economy, and it identifies historical and logical conditions for the development of the capitalist system. Quote, primitive, quote, originary, indicating a precondition for the existence of capitalist relations as much as a specific event in time. Marx, however, analyzed primitive accumulation almost exclusively from the viewpoint of the waged industrial proletariat, the protagonist, in his view, of the revolutionary process of his time and the foundation for the future communist society. Thus, in his account, primitive accumulation consists essentially in the expropriation of the land from the European peasantry and the formation of the, quote, free, close quote, independent worker, though he acknowledged that the discovery of gold and silver in America, the extirpation, enslavement, and entombment in mines of the Aboriginal population of America, the beginning of the conquest and looting of the East Indies, the turning of Africa into a preserve for the commercial hunting of black skins, are the chief moments of primitive accumulation. Marx, 1909, Volume 1. Marx also recognized that a great deal of capital, which today appears in the United States without any certificate of birth, was yesterday in England the capitalized blood of children. By contrast, we do not find in his work any mention of the profound transformations that capitalism introduced in the reproduction of labor power and the social position of women. Nor does Marx's analysis of primitive accumulation mention the great witch hunt of the 16th and 17th centuries, although this state-sponsored terror campaign was central to the defeat of the European peasantry, facilitating its expulsion from the lands it once held in common. In this chapter and those that follow, I will discuss these developments, especially with reference to Europe, arguing that 1, the expropriation of European workers from their means of subsistence and the enslavement of Native Americans and Africans to the mines and plantations of the, quote, New World were not the only means by which a world proletariat was formed and, quote, accumulated. 2, this process required the transformation of the body into a work machine and the subjugation of women to the reproduction of the workforce. Most of all, it required the destruction of the power of women, which in Europe as in America was achieved through the extermination of the witches. Primitive accumulation, then, was not simply an accumulation and concentration of exploitable workers and capital. It was also an accumulation of differences and divisions within the working class, whereby hierarchies built upon gender as well as, quote, race and age became constitutive of class rule in the formation of the modern proletariat. 4. We cannot, therefore, identify capitalist accumulation with the liberation of the worker, female or male, as many Marxists among others have done, or see the advent of capitalism as a moment of historical progress. On the contrary, capitalism has created more brutal and insidious forms of enslavement, as it has planted into the body of the proletariat deep divisions that have served to intensify and conceal exploitation. It is in great part because of these imposed divisions, especially those between women and men, that the capitalist accumulation continues to devastate life in every corner of the planet. I'm skipping a few pages, excerptable, and beginning again. There are also misconceptions about the effectiveness of the open field system of agriculture. Neoliberal historians have described it as wasteful, but even a supporter of land privatization like Jean de Vries recognizes that the communal use of agricultural fields had many advantages. It protected the peasants from harvest failure due to the variety of strips to which a family had access. It also allowed for manageable work schedule, since each strip required attention at a different time, and it encouraged a democratic way of life built on self-government and self-reliance, since all decisions, when to plant or harvest, when to drain the fens, how many animals to allow on the commons, were taken by peasant assemblies. The same considerations apply to the, quote, commons. Disparaged in 16th century literature as a source of laziness and disorder, the commons were essential to the reproduction of many small farmers or cotters who survived only because they had access to meadows in which to keep cows, or woods in which to gather timber, wild berries and herbs, or quarries, fish ponds, and open spaces in which to meet. Beside encouraging collective decision-making and work cooperation, the commons were the material foundation upon which peasant solidarity and sociality could thrive. All the festivals, games, and gatherings of the peasant community were held on the commons. The social function of the commons was especially important for women, who, having less title to land and less social power, were more dependent on them for their subsistence, autonomy, and sociality. Paraphrasing Alice Clark's statement about the importance of markets for women in pre-capitalist Europe, we can say that the commons, too, were for women the center of social life, the place where they convened, exchanged views, took advice, and where a woman's viewpoint on communal events, autonomous from that of men, could form. The web of cooperative relations, which R.D. Tawney has referred to as the primitive communism of the feudal village, crumbled when the open field system was abolished and the communal lands were fenced off. Not only did cooperation in agricultural labor die when the land was privatized and individual labor contracts replaced collective ones, economic differences among the rural population deepened as the number of poor squatters increased who had nothing left but a cot and a cow and no choice but to go with, quote, bended knee and cap in hand, end quote, to beg for a job. Social cohesion broke down. Families disintegrated. The youth left the village to join the increasing number of vagabonds or itinerant workers, soon to become the social problem of the age, while the elderly were left behind to fend for themselves. Particularly disadvantaged were older women who, no longer supported by their children, fell into the poor roles or survived by borrowing, petty theft, and delayed payments. The outcome was a peasantry polarized not only by the deepening economic inequalities, but by a web of hatred and resentments that is well documented in the records of the witch hunt, which show that quarrels relating to requests for help, the trespassing of animals, or unpaid rents were in the background of many accusations. The enclosures also undermine the economic situation of the artisans, in the same way in which multinational corporations take advantage of the peasants expropriated from their lands by the World Bank to construct, quote, free export zones, close quote, where commodities are produced at the lowest cost. So in the 16th and 17th centuries, merchant capitalists took advantage of the cheap labor force that had been made available in the rural areas to break the power of the urban guilds and destroy the artisans' independence. This was especially the case in the textile industry that was reorganized as a rural cottage industry and on the basis of the, quote, putting out system, the ancestor of today's, quote, informal economy, close quote, also built on the labor of women and children. But textile workers were not the only ones whose labor was cheapened. As soon as they lost access to land, all workers were plunged into a dependence unknown in medieval times, as their landless condition gave employers the power to cut their pay and lengthen the working day. In Protestant areas, this happened under the guise of religious reform, which doubled the work year by eliminating the saints' days. Not surprisingly, with land expropriation came a change in the workers' attitude toward the wage. While in the Middle Ages, wages could be viewed as an instrument of freedom, in contrast to the compulsion of the labor services, as soon as access to land came to an end, wages began to be viewed as instruments of enslavement. Such was the hatred that workers felt for waged labor that Jared Winstanley, the leader of the Diggers, declared that it did not make any difference whether one lived under the enemy or under one's brother if one worked for a wage. This explains the growth, in the wake of the enclosures, using the term in a broad sense to include all forms of land privatization, of the number of, quote, vagabonds and, quote, masterless men who preferred to take to the road and risk enslavement or death, as prescribed by the, quote, bloody legislation passed against them, rather than to work for a wage. It also explains the strenuous struggle which peasants made to defend their land from expropriation, no matter how meager its size. In England, anti-enclosure struggles began in the late 15th century and continued through the 16th and 17th, when leveling the enclosing hedges became the most common species of social protest and the symbol of class conflict. Anti-enclosure riots often turned into mass uprisings. The most notorious was Kett's Rebellion, named after its leader, Robert Kett, that took place in Norfolk in 1549. This was no small nocturnal affair. At its peak, the rebels numbered 16,000, had an artillery, defeated a government army of 12,000, and even captured Norwich, at the time the second largest city in England. They also drafted a program that, if realized, would have checked the advance of agrarian capitalism and eliminated all vestiges of feudal power in the country. It consisted of 29 demands that Kett, a farmer and tanner, presented to the Lord Protector. The first was that, quote, from henceforth no man shall enclose any more, close quote. Other articles demanded that rents should be reduced to the rates that had prevailed 65 years before, that, quote, all freeholders and copyholders may take the profits of all commons, close quote, and that, quote, all bondmen may be made free, for God made all free with his precious blood shedding. These demands were put into practice. Throughout Norfolk, enclosing hedges were uprooted, and only when another government army attacked them were the rebels stopped. 3,500 were slain in the massacre that followed. Hundreds more were wounded. Kett and his brother William were hanged outside Norwich's walls. Anti-enclosure struggles continued, however, through the Jacobean period, with a notable increase in the presence of women. During the reign of James I, about 10% of enclosure riots included women among the rebels. Some were all-female protests. In 1607, for instance, 37 women, led by a Captain Dorothy, attacked coal miners working on what women claimed to be the village commons in Thorpe Moor in Yorkshire. 40 women went to, quote, cast down the fences and hedges of an enclosure in Waddingham, Lincolnshire in 1608 and in 1609, on a manor of Dunchurch, Warwickshire. Quote, 15 women, including wives, widows, spinsters, unmarried daughters, and servants, took it upon themselves to assemble at night to dig up the hedges and level the ditches. Again at York in May 1624, women destroyed an enclosure and went to prison for it. They were said to have, quote, enjoyed tobacco and ale after their feat. Then in 1641, a crowd that broke into an enclosed fen at Buckton consisted mainly of women aided by boys, and these were just a few instances of a confrontation in which women holding pitchforks and scythes resisted the fencing of the land or the draining of the fens when their livelihood was threatened. This strong female presence has been attributed to the belief that women were above the law, being, quote, covered legally by their husbands. Even men, we are told, dress like women to pull up the fences. But this explanation should not be taken too far, for the government soon eliminated this privilege and started arresting and imprisoning women involved in anti-enclosure riots. Moreover, we should not assume that women had no stake of their own in the resistance to land expropriation. The opposite was the case. As with the commutation, women were those who suffered most when the land was lost and the village community fell apart. Part of the reason is that it was far more difficult for them to become vagabonds or migrant workers, for a nomadic life exposed them to male violence, especially at a time when misogyny was escalating. Women were also less mobile on account of pregnancies and the caring of children, a fact overlooked by scholars who considered the flight from servitude through migration and other forms of nomadism the paradigmatic forms of struggle. Nor could women become soldiers for pay, though some joined armies as cooks, washers, prostitutes, and wives. But by the 17th century, this option too vanished, as armies were further regimented and the crowds of women that used to follow them were expelled from the battlefields. Women were also more negatively impacted by the enclosures because as soon as land was privatized and monetary relations began to dominate economic life, they found it more difficult than men to support themselves, being increasingly confined to reproductive labor at the very time when this work was being completely devalued. As we will see, this phenomenon, which has accompanied the shift from a subsistence to a money economy in every phase of capitalist development, can be attributed to several factors. It is clear, however, that the commercialization of economic life provided the material conditions for it. With the demise of the subsistence economy that had prevailed in pre-capitalist Europe, the unity of production and reproduction, which has been typical of all societies based on production for use, came to an end, as these activities became the carriers of different social relations and were sexually differentiated. In the new monetary regime, only production for market was defined as a value-creating activity, whereas the reproduction of the worker began to be considered as valueless from an economic point of view and even ceased to be considered as work. Reproductive work continued to be paid, though at the lowest rates, when performed for the master class or outside the home. But the economic importance of the reproduction of labor power carried out in the home and its function in the accumulation of capital became invisible, being mystified as a natural vocation and labeled women's labor. In addition, women were excluded from many waged occupations, and when they worked for a wage, they earned a pittance compared to the average male wage. These historic changes that peaked in the 19th century with the creation of the full-time housewife redefined women's position in society and in relation to men. The sexual division of labor that emerged from it not only fixed women to reproductive work, but it increased their dependence on men, enabling the state and employers to use the male wage as a means to command women's labor. In this way, the separation of commodity production from the reproduction of labor power also made possible the development of a specifically capitalist use of the wage and of the markets as a means for the accumulation of unpaid labor. Most importantly, the separation of production from reproduction created a class of proletarian women who were as dispossessed as men, but unlike their male relatives, in a society that was becoming increasingly monetarized, had almost no access to wages, thus being forced into a condition of chronic poverty, economic dependence, and invisibility as workers. As we will see, the devaluation and feminization of reproductive labor was a disaster also for male workers, for the devaluation of reproductive labor inevitably devalued its product, labor power. But there is no doubt that in the transition from feudalism to capitalism, women suffered a unique process of social degradation that was fundamental to the accumulation of capital and has remained so ever since. Also, in view of these developments, we cannot say then that the separation of the worker from the land and the advent of a money economy realized the struggle which the medieval serfs had fought to free themselves from bondage. It was not the workers, male or female, who were liberated by land privatization. What was liberated was capital, as the land was now, quote, free to function as a means of accumulation and exploitation, rather than as a means of subsistence. Liberated were the landlords, who now could unload onto the workers most of the cost of their reproduction, giving them access to some means of subsistence only when directly employed. When work could not be available or would not be sufficiently profitable, as in times of commercial or agricultural crisis, workers instead could be laid off and left to starve. The separation of workers from their means of subsistence and their new dependence on monetary relations also meant that the real wage could now be cut and women's labor could be further devalued with respect to men's through monetary manipulation. It is not a coincidence, then, that as soon as land began to be privatized, the prices of foodstuffs, which for 2 centuries had stagnated, began to rise. Subhead: The Price Revolution and the Pauperization of the European Working Class. This inflationary phenomenon, which due to its devastating social consequences has been named the Price Revolution, was attributed by contemporaries and later economists, Adam Smith, to the arrival of gold and silver from America, quote, pouring into Europe through Spain in a mammoth stream. But it has been noted that prices had been rising before these metals started circulating through the European markets. Moreover, in themselves, gold and silver are not capital and could have been put to other uses, for instance, to make jewelry or golden cupolas or to embroider clothes. If they functioned as price-regulating devices capable of turning even wheat into a precious commodity, this was because they were planted into a developing capitalist world in which a growing percentage of the population, 1/3 in England, had no access to land and had to buy the food that they had once produced, and because the ruling class had learned to use the magical power of money to cut labor costs. In other words, prices rose because of the development of a national and international market system encouraging the export-import of agricultural products, and because merchants hoarded goods to sell them later at a higher price. In September 1565 in Antwerp, quote, while the poor were literally starving in the streets, a warehouse collapsed under the weight of the grain packed in it. It was under these circumstances that the arrival of the American treasure triggered a massive redistribution of wealth and a new proletarianization process. Rising prices ruined the small farmers who had to give up their land to buy grain or bread when the harvest could not feed their families, and created a class of capitalist entrepreneurs who accumulated fortunes by investing in agriculture and money lending at a time when having money was for many people a matter of life or death. The price revolution also triggered a historic collapse in the real wage comparable to that which has occurred in our time throughout Africa, Asia, and Latin America in the countries, quote, structurally adjusted by the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. By 1600, real wages in Spain had lost 30% of their purchasing power with respect to what they had been in 1511, and the collapse was just as sharp in other countries. While the price of food went up 8 times, wages increased only by 3 times. This was not the work of the invisible hand of the market, but the product of a state policy that prevented laborers from organizing while giving merchants the maximum freedom with regard to the pricing and movement of goods. Predictably, within a few decades, the real wage lost 2/3 of its purchasing power, as shown in the changes that intervened in the daily wages of an English carpenter, expressed in kilograms of grain between the 14th and 18th century. There follows a chart. So the daily wages of a carpenter in 1351 to 1400 could be stated as 121 kilograms of grain, and by 1751 to 1800, 79 kilograms. It took centuries for wages in Europe to return to the level they had reached in the late Middle Ages. Things deteriorated to the point that in England by 1550, male artisans had to work 40 weeks to earn the same income that at the beginning of the century they had been able to obtain in 15 weeks. In France, wages dropped by 60% between 1470 and 1570. The wage collapse was especially disastrous for women. In the 14th century, they had received half the pay of a man for the same task, but by the mid-16th century, they were receiving only 1/3 of the reduced male wage and could no longer support themselves by wage work, neither in agriculture nor in manufacturing, a fact undoubtedly responsible for the massive spread of prostitution in this period. What followed was the absolute impoverishment of the European working class, a phenomenon so widespread and general that by 1550 and long after, workers in Europe were referred to as simply the poor. Evidence for this dramatic impoverishment is the change that occurred in the workers' diets. Meat disappeared from their tables, except for a few scraps of lard, and so did beer and wine, salt, and olive oil. From the 16th to the 18th centuries, the workers' diets consisted essentially of bread, the main expense in their budget. This was a historic setback, whatever we may think of dietary norms, compared to the abundance of meat that had typified the late Middle Ages. Peter Krietke writes that at that time the annual meat consumption had reached the figure of 100 kilos per person, an incredible quantity even by today's standards. Up to the 19th century, this figure declined to less than 20 kilos. Braudel, too, speaks of the end of carnivorous Europe, summoning as a witness the Swabian Heinrich Müller, who in 1550 commented that, in the past, they ate differently at the peasant's house. Then there was meat and food in profusion every day. Tables at village fairs and feasts sank under their load. Today, everything has truly changed. For some years, in fact, what a calamitous time, what high prices, and the food of the most comfortably off peasants was always almost worse than that of day laborers and valets previously. Valets, I guess. Not only did meat disappear, but food shortages became common, aggravated in times of harvest failure, when the scanty grain reserves sent the price of grain sky high, condemning city dwellers to starvation. This is what occurred in the famine years of the 1540s and 1550s, and again in the decades of the 1580s and 1590s, which were some of the worst in the history of the European proletariat, coinciding with widespread unrest and a record number of witch trials. But malnutrition was rampant also in normal times, so that food acquired a high symbolic value as a marker of rank. The desire for it among the poor reached epic proportions, inspiring dreams of Pantagruelian orgies like those described by Rabelais in his Gargantua and Pantagruel, causing nightmarish obsessions such as the conviction spread among northeastern Italian farmers that witches roamed the countryside at night to feed upon their cattle. Indeed, the Europe that was preparing to become a Promethean world mover, presumably taking humankind to new technological and cultural heights, was a place where people never had enough to eat. Food became an object of such intense desire that it was believed that the poor sold their souls to the devil to get their hands on it. Europe was also a place where, in times of bad harvests, country folk fed upon acorns, wild roots, or the bark of trees, and multitudes roved the countryside weeping and wailing, quote, so hungry that they would devour the beans in the fields. Or they invaded the cities to benefit from grain distributions, or to attack the houses and granaries of the rich, who in turn rushed to get arms and shut the city gates to keep the starving out. That the transition to capitalism inaugurated a long period of starvation for workers in Europe, which plausibly ended because of the economic expansion produced by colonization, it also demonstrated by the fact that while in the 14th and 15th centuries the proletarian struggle had centered around the demand for liberty and less work, by the 16th and 17th, it was mostly spurred by hunger, taking the form of assaults on bakeries and granaries, and of riots against the export of local crops. The authorities described those who participated in these attacks as, quote, good for nothing, or, quote, poor and, quote, humble people, but most were craftsmen, living by this time from hand to mouth. It was the women who usually initiated and led the food revolts. 6 of the 31 food riots in 17th century France, studied by Yves-Marie Berset, were made up exclusively of women. In the others, the female presence was so conspicuous that Berset calls them women's riots. Commenting on this phenomenon with reference to the 18th century England, Sheila Rowbotham concluded that women were prominent in this type of protest because of their role as their family's caretakers. But women were also those most ruined by high prices, for having less access to money and employment than men, they were more dependent on cheap food for survival. This is why, despite their subordinate status, they took quickly to the streets when food prices went up, or when rumors spread that grain supplies were being removed from town. This is what happened at the time of the Cordoba uprising of 1652, which started, quote, early in the morning when a poor woman went weeping through the streets of the poor quarter, holding the body of her son who had died of hunger. The same occurred in Montpellier in 1645 when women took to the streets to protect their children from starvation. In France, women besieged the bakeries when they became convinced that grain was to be embezzled, or found out that the rich had bought the best bread and the remaining was lighter or more expensive. Crowds of poor women would then gather at the bakers' stalls, demanding bread and charging the bakers with hiding their supplies. Riots broke out also in the squares where grain markets were held, or along the routes taken by the carts with the corn to be exported at the riverbanks where boatmen could be seen loading their sacks. On these occasions, the rioters ambushed the carts with pitchforks and sticks, the men carrying away the stacks, the women gathering as much grain as they could hold in their skirts. The struggle for food was fought also by other means, such as poaching, stealing from one's neighbor's fields or homes, and assaults on the houses of the rich. In Troyes, in 1523, rumor had it that the poor had put the houses of the rich on fire, preparing to invade them. At Malines, in the Low Countries, the houses of speculators were marked by angry peasants with blood. Not surprisingly, quote, food crimes loom large in the disciplinary procedures of the 16th and 17th centuries. Exemplary is the recurrence of the theme of the, quote, diabolical banquet in the witch trials, suggesting that feasting on roasted mutton, white bread, and wine was now considered a diabolic act in the case of the, quote, common people. But the main weapons available to the poor in their struggle for survival were their own famished bodies, as in times of famine, hordes of vagabonds and beggars surrounded the better half dead of hunger and disease, grabbing their arms, exposing their wounds to them, and forcing them to live in a state of constant fear at the prospect of both contamination and revolt. Quote, you cannot walk down a street or stop in a square, a Venetian man wrote in the mid-16th century, without multitudes surrounding you to beg for charity. You see hunger written on their faces, their eyes like gemless rings, the wretchedness of their bodies with skins shaped only by bones. A century later in Florence, the scene was about the same. Quote, "It was impossible to hear Mass," one G. Balducci complained in April 1650. "So much was one importuned during the service by wretched people naked and covered with sores." Subhead: The state intervention in the reproduction of labor, poor relief, and the criminalization of the working class. The struggle for food was not the only front in the battle against the spread of capitalist relations. Everywhere, masses of people resisted the destruction of their former ways of existence, fighting against land privatization, the abolition of customary rights, the imposition of new taxes, wage dependence, and the continuous presence of armies in their neighborhoods, which was so hated that people rushed to close the gates of their towns to prevent soldiers from settling among them. In France, 1,000 émotions, uprisings, occurred between the 1530s and 1670s, many involving entire provinces and requiring the intervention of troops. England, Italy, and Spain present a similar picture, indicating that the pre-capitalist world of the village, which Marx dismissed under the rubric of rural isolation, could produce as high a level of struggle as any the industrial proletariat has waged. In the Middle Ages, migration, vagabondage, and the rise of, quote, crimes against property were part of the resistance to impoverishment and dispossession. These phenomena now took on massive proportions. Everywhere, if we give credit to the complaints of the contemporary authorities, vagabonds were swarming, changing cities, crossing borders, sleeping in the haystacks, or crowding at the gates of towns. A vast humanity involved in a diaspora of its own that for decades escaped the authorities' control. 6,000 vagabonds were reported in Venice alone in 1545. Quote, "In Spain, vagrants cluttered the roads, stopping at every town," close quote. Starting with England, always a pioneer in these matters, the state passed new, far harsher anti-vagabond laws, prescribing enslavement and capital punishment in cases of recidivism. But repression was not effective, and the roads of 16th and 17th century Europe remained places of great commotion and encounters. Through them passed heretics escaping persecution, discharged soldiers, journeymen, and other, quote, humble folk in search of employment, and then foreign artisans, evicted peasants, prostitutes, hucksters, petty thieves, professional beggars. Above all, through the roads of Europe passed the tales, stories, and experiences of a developing proletariat. Meanwhile, the crime rates also escalated in such proportions that we can assume that a massive reclamation and reappropriation of the stolen communal wealth was underway. Today, these aspects of the transition to capitalism may seem, for Europe at least, things of the past, or as Marx put it in the Grundrisse, quote, "historical preconditions," close quote, "of capitalist development to be overcome by more mature forms of capitalism." But the essential similarity between these phenomena and the social consequences of the new phase of globalization that we are witnessing tells us otherwise. Pauperization, rebellion, and the escalation of, quote, crime are structural elements of capitalist accumulation, as capitalism must strip the workforce from its means of reproduction to impose its own rule. That in the industrializing regions of Europe by the 19th century, the most extreme forms of proletarian misery and rebellion had disappeared is not a proof against this claim. Proletarian misery and rebellions did not come to an end. They only lessened to the degree that the super exploitation of workers had been exported through the institutionalization of slavery at first, and later through the continuing expansion of colonial domination. As for the, quote, transition period, this remained in Europe a time of intense social conflict. providing the stage for a set of state initiatives that, judging from their effects, had three main objectives. A, to create a more disciplined workforce. B, to diffuse social protest. And C, to fix workers to the jobs forced upon them. Let us look at them in turn. In pursuit of social discipline, an attack was launched against all forms of collective sociality and sexuality, including sports, games, dances, ale wakes, festivals, and other group rituals that had been a source of bonding and solidarity among workers. It was sanctioned by a deluge of bills, 25 in England just for the regulation of alehouses in the years between 1601 and 1606. Peter Burke, in his work on this subject, has spoken of it as a campaign against, quote, popular culture. But we can see that what was at stake was the desocialization or de-collectivization of the reproduction of the workforce, as well as the attempt to impose a more productive use of leisure time. This process in England reached its climax with the coming to power of the Puritans in the aftermath of the Civil War, 1642 to 49, when the fear of social indiscipline prompted the banning of all proletarian gatherings and merrymaking. But the, quote, moral reformation was equally intense in non-Protestant areas, where in the same period, religious processions were replacing the dancing and singing that had been held in and out of the churches. Even the individual's relation with God was privatized in Protestant areas, with the institution of a direct relationship between the individual and the divinity. In the Catholic areas, with the introduction of individual confession. The church itself, as a community center, ceased to host any social activity other than those addressed to the cult. As a result, the physical enclosure operated by land privatization and the hedging of the commons was amplified by a process of social enclosure, the reproduction of workers shifting from the open field to the home, from the community to the family, from the public space, the common, the church, to the private. Secondly, in the decades between 1530 and 1560, a system of public assistance was introduced in at least 60 European towns, both by the initiative of the local municipalities and by direct intervention of the central state. Its precise goals are still debated. While much of the literature on the topic sees the introduction of public assistance as a response to a humanitarian crisis that jeopardized social control, in his massive study of coerced labor, the French Marxist scholar Jan Mouillet-Boutang insists its primary objectives was the great fixation of the proletariat, that is, the attempt to prevent the flight of labor. In any event, the introduction of public assistance was a turning point in the state relation between workers and capital and the definition of the function of the state. It was the first recognition of the unsustainability of a capitalist system ruling exclusively by means of hunger and terror. It was also the first step in the reconstruction of the state as the guarantor of the class relation and as the chief supervisor of the reproduction and disciplining of the workforce. Antecedents for this function can be found in the 14th century, when faced with the generalization of the anti-feudal struggle, the state had emerged as the only agency capable of confronting a working class that was regionally unified, armed, and no longer confined in its demands to the political economy of the manor. In 1351, with the passing of the Statute of Laborers in England, which fixed the minimum wage, the state had formally taken charge of the regulation and suppression of labor, which the local lords were no longer capable of guaranteeing. But it was with the introduction of public assistance that the state began to claim ownership of the workforce, and a capitalist, quote, division of labor was instituted within the ruling class, enabling employers to relinquish any responsibility for the reproduction of workers in the certainty that the state would intervene, either with the carrot or with the stick, to address the inevitable crises. With this innovation, a leap occurred also in the management of social reproduction. resulting in the introduction of demographic recording, census taking, the recording of mortality, natality, marriage rates, and the application of accounting to social relations. Exemplary is the work of the administrators of the Bureau des Pauvres in Lyon, who, by the end of the 16th century, had learned to calculate the number of the poor, assess the amount of food needed by each child and adult, and keep track of the deceased, to make sure that nobody could claim assistance in the name of a dead person. Along with this new, quote, social science, an international debate also developed on the administration of public assistance, anticipating the contemporary debate on welfare. Should only those unable to work, described as the deserving poor, be supported, or should, quote, able-bodied laborers unable to find a job also be given help? And how much or how little should they be given, so as not to be discouraged from looking for work? These questions were crucial from the point of view of social discipline, as a key objective of public aid was to tie workers to their jobs. But on these matters, a consensus could rarely be reached. While humanist reformers like Jean-Louis Vive and spokesmen for the wealthy burghers recognized the economic and disciplinary benefits of a more liberal and centralized dispensation of charity, not exceeding the distribution of bread, however, part of the clergy strenuously opposed the ban on individual donations. But across differences of systems and opinions, assistance was administered with such stinginess that it generated as much conflict as appeasement. Those assisted resented the humiliating rituals imposed on them, like wearing the mark of infamy, previously reserved for lepers and Jews, or in France, participating in the annual processions of the poor, in which they had to parade singing hymns and holding candles, and they vehemently protested when the alms were not promptly given or were inadequate to their needs. In response, in some French towns, gibbets were erected at the time of food distributions or when the poor were asked to work in exchange for the food they received. In England, as the 16th century progressed, receipt of public aid, also for children and the elderly, was made conditional on the incarceration of the recipients in workhouses, where they became the experimental subjects for a variety of work schemes. Consequently, the attack on workers that had begun with the enclosures and the price revolution in the space of a century led to the criminalization of the working class. That is, the formation of a vast proletariat, either incarcerated in the newly constructed workhouses and correction houses, or seeking its survival outside the law and living in open antagonism to the state, always one step away from the whip and the noose. From the viewpoint of the formation of a laborious workforce, this was a decisive failure, and the constant preoccupation with the question of social discipline in 16th and 17th century political circles indicates that the contemporary statesmen and entrepreneurs were keenly aware of it. Moreover, the social crisis that this general state of rebelliousness provoked was aggravated in the second half of the 16th century by a new economic contraction, in great part caused by the dramatic population decline that occurred in Spanish America after the conquest and the shrinking of the colonial economies. Subhead: Population decline, economic crisis, and the disciplining of women. Within less than a century after the landing of Columbus on the American continent, the colonizers' dream of an infinite supply of labor, echoing the explorers' estimate of an infinite number of trees in the forests of Americas, was dashed. Europeans had brought death to America. Estimates of the population collapse which affected the region in the wake of the colonial invasion vary, but scholars almost unanimously liken its effects to an, quote, American Holocaust. According to David Stannard, in the century after the conquest, the population declined by 75 million across South America, representing 95% of its inhabitants. This is also the estimate of Andre Gunder Frank, who writes that, quote, within little more than a century, the Indian population declined by 90% and even 95% in Mexico, Peru, and some other regions. In Mexico, the population fell from 11 million in 1519 to 6.5 million in Mexico, the population fell from 11 million in 1519 to 6.5 million in 1565 to about 2.5 million in 1600. By 1580, disease, assisted by Spanish brutality, had killed off or driven away most of the people of the Antilles and the lowlands of New Spain, Peru, and the Caribbean littoral, and it would soon wipe out many more in Brazil. The clergy rationalized this, quote, Holocaust as God's punishment for the Indians', quote, bestial behavior, but its economic consequences were not ignored. In addition, by the 1580s, population began to decline also in Western Europe and continued to do so into the 17th century, reaching a peak in Germany where 1/3 of the population was lost. With the exception of the Black Death, 1345 to 1348, this was a population crisis without precedents, and statistics, as awful as they are, tell only a part of the story. Death struck at the poor. It was not the rich, for the most part, who perished when the plague or the smallpox swept the towns, but craftsmen, day laborers, and vagabonds. They died in such numbers that their bodies paved the streets, and the authorities denounced the existence of a conspiracy, instigating the population to hunt for the malefactors. But the population decline was also blamed on low natality rates and the reluctance of the poor to reproduce themselves. To what extent this charge was justified is difficult to tell, since demographic recording before the 17th century was rather uneven. But we know that by the end of the 16th century, the age of marriage was increasing in all social classes, and that in the same period, the number of abandoned children, a new phenomenon, started to grow. We also have the complaints of ministers who from the pulpit charged that the youth did not marry and procreate in order not to bring more mouths into the world than they could feed. The peak of the demographic and economic crisis were the decades of the 1620s and 30s. In Europe, as in the colonies, markets shrank, trade stopped, unemployment became widespread, and for a while there was the possibility that the developing capitalist economy might crash. For the integration between the colonial and European economies had reached a point where the reciprocal impact of the crisis rapidly accelerated its course. This was the first international economic crisis. It was a, quote, general crisis, as historians have called it. It is in this context that the question of the relation between labor, population, and the accumulation of wealth came to the foreground of political debate and strategy to produce the first elements of a population policy and a, quote, biopower regime. The crudeness of the concepts applied, often confusing populousness with population, and the brutality of the means by which the state began to punish any behavior obstructing population growth should not deceive us in this respect. It is my contention that it was the population crisis of the 16th and 17th centuries, not the end of famine in Europe in the 18th, as Foucault has argued, that turned reproduction and population growth into state matters, as well as primary objects of intellectual discourse. I further argue that the intensification of the persecution of, quote, witches and the new disciplinary methods that the state adopted in this period to regulate procreation and break women's control over reproduction are also to be traced to this crisis. The evidence for this argument is circumstantial, and it should be recognized that other factors contributed to increase the determination of the European power structure to control more strictly women's reproductive function. Among them, we must include the increasing privatization of property and economic relations that, within the bourgeoisie, generated a new anxiety concerning the question of paternity and the conduct of women. Similarly, in the charge that witches sacrificed children to the devil, a key theme in the great witch hunt of the 16th and 17th centuries, we can read not only a preoccupation with population decline, but also the fear of the propertied classes with regard to their subordinates, particularly low-class women who, as servants, beggars, or healers, had many opportunities to enter their employers' houses and cause them harm. It cannot be a pure coincidence, however, that at the very moment when population was declining and an ideology was forming that stressed the centrality of labor in economic life, severe penalties were introduced in the legal codes of Europe to punish women guilty of reproductive crimes. The concomitant development of a population crisis, an expansionist population theory, and the introduction of policies promoting population growth is well documented. By the mid-16th century, the idea that the number of citizens determines a nation's wealth had become something of a social axiom. In my view, wrote the French political thinker and demonologist Jean Baudin, one should never be afraid of having too many subjects or too many citizens, for the strength of the Commonwealth consists in men. The Italian economist Giovanni Botero had a more sophisticated approach, recognizing the need for a balance between the number of people and the means of subsistence. Still, he declared that, quote, the greatness of a city did not depend on its physical size or the circuit of its walls, but exclusively on the number of its residents. Henry IV saying that the strength and wealth of a king lie in the number and opulence of his citizens sums up the demographic thought of the age. Concern with population growth is detectable also in the program of the Protestant Reformation. Dismissing the traditional Christian exaltation of chastity, the Reformers valorized marriage, sexuality, and even women because of their reproductive capacity. Woman is, quote, needed to bring about the increase of the human race, Luther conceded, reflecting that, quote, whatever their weaknesses, women possess one virtue that cancels them all. They have a womb and they can give birth. Support for population growth climaxed with the rise of mercantilism, which made the presence of a large population the key to the prosperity and power of a nation. Mercantilism has often been dismissed by mainstream economists as a crude system of thought because of its assumption that the wealth of nations is proportional to the quantity of laborers and money available to them. The brutal means which the mercantilists applied in order to force people to work in their hunger for labor have contributed to their disrepute, as most economists wish to maintain the illusion that capitalism fosters freedom rather than coercion. It was a mercantilist class that invented the workhouses, hunted down vagabonds, transported criminals to the American colonies, and invested in the slave trade, all the while asserting the, quote, utility of poverty and declaring, quote, idleness a social plague. Thus, it has not been recognized that in the mercantilist theory and practice, we find the most direct expression of the requirements of primitive accumulation and the first capitalist policy, explicitly addressing the problem of the reproduction of the workforce. This policy, as we have seen, had an intensive side, consisting in the imposition of a totalitarian regime, using every means to extract the maximum of work from every individual, regardless of age and condition. But it also had an extensive one, consisting in the effort to expand the size of population and thereby the size of the army and the workforce. Skipping a few pages again. New subhead, the devaluation of women's labor. The criminalization of women's control over procreation is a phenomenon whose importance cannot be overemphasized, both from the viewpoint of its effects on women and its consequences for the capitalist organization of work. As is well documented through the Middle Ages, women had possessed many means of contraception, mostly consisting of herbs, which turned into potions, and pessaries, or suppositories, were used to quicken a woman's period, provoke an abortion, or create a condition of sterility. In Eve's Herbs, A History of Contraception in the West, 1997, the American historian John Riddle has given us an extensive catalog of the substances that were most used and the effects expected of them or most likely to occur. The criminalization of contraception expropriated women from this knowledge that had been transmitted from generation to generation, giving them some autonomy with respect to childbirth. It appears that in some cases this knowledge was not lost, but was only driven underground. Yet when birth control again made its appearance on the social scene, contraceptive methods were no longer of the type that women could use, but were specifically created for use by men. What demographic consequences followed from this shift is a question that for the moment I will not pursue, though I refer to Riddle's work for a discussion of this matter. Here, I only want to stress that by denying women control over their bodies, the state deprived them of the most fundamental condition for physical and psychological integrity and degraded maternity to the status of forced labor, in addition to confining women to reproductive work in a way unknown in previous societies. Nevertheless, forcing women to procreate against their will, or, as a feminist song from the 70s had it, forcing them to, quote, produce children for the state, only in part defined women's function in the new sexual division of labor. A complementary aspect was the definition of women as non-workers, a process much studied by feminist historians, which by the end of the 17th century was nearly completed. By this time, women were losing ground, even with respect to jobs that had been their prerogatives, such as ale brewing and midwifery, where their employment was subjected to new restrictions. Proletarian women in particular found it difficult to obtain any job other than those carrying the lowest status. As domestic servants, the occupation of a third of the female workforce, farm hands, spinners, knitters, embroiderers, hawkers, wet nurses. As Mary Wiesner, among others, tells us, the assumption was gaining ground in the law, in the tax records, in the ordinances of the guilds, that women should not work outside the home and should engage in, quote, production only in order to help their husbands. It was even argued that any work women did at home was non-work and worthless even when done for the market. Thus, if a woman sewed some clothes, it was, quote, domestic work or, quote, housekeeping, even if the clothes were not for the family, whereas when a man did the same task, it was considered productive. Such was the devaluation of women's labor that city governments told the guilds to overlook the production that women, especially widows, did in their homes because it was not real work, because the women needed it not to fall on public relief. Wiesner adds that women accepted this fiction and even apologized for asking for work, pleading for it on account of their need to support themselves. Soon all female work, if done in the home, was defined as housekeeping, and even when done outside the home, it was paid less than men's work and never enough for women to be able to live by it. Marriage was now seen as a woman's true career, and women's inability to support themselves was taken so much for granted that when a single woman tried to settle in a village, she was driven away even if she earned a wage. Combined with land dispossession, this loss of power with regard to wage employment led to the massification of prostitution. As Leroy Ladurie reports, the growth in the number of prostitutes in France was visible everywhere. From Avignon to Narbonne to Barcelona, sporting women stationed themselves at the gates of the cities, in streets of red light districts, and on the bridges, so that by 1594, the, quote, shameful traffic was flourishing as never before. The situation was similar in England and Spain, where every day in the cities, poor women arriving from the countryside, and even the wives of craftsmen, rounded up the family income with this work. A proclamation issued by the political authorities in Madrid in 1631 denounced the problem, complaining that many vagabond women were now wandering among the city's streets, alleys, and taverns, enticing men to sin with them. But no sooner had prostitution become the main force of subsistence for a large female population then the institutional attitude towards it changed. Whereas in the late Middle Ages it had been officially accepted as a necessary evil, and prostitutes had benefited from the high wage regime, in the 16th century the situation was reversed. In a climate of intense misogyny characterized by the advance of the Protestant Reformation and witch hunting, prostitution was first subjected to new restrictions and then criminalized. Everywhere between 1530 and 1560, town brothels were closed, and prostitutes, especially streetwalkers, were subjected to severe penalties. Severe penalties, banishment, flogging, and other cruel forms of chastisement. Among them was the ducking school, a piece of grim theater, as Nikki Roberts describes it, whereby the victims were tied up. Sometimes they were forced into a cage, and then were repeatedly immersed in rivers or ponds till they almost drowned. Meanwhile, in 16th century France, the raping of a prostitute ceased to be a crime. In Madrid as well, it was decided that female vagabonds and prostitutes should not be allowed to stay and sleep in the streets and under the porticos of the town, and if caught, could be given 100 lashes, and then should be banned from the city for 6 years, in addition to having their heads and eyebrows shaved. What can account for this drastic attack on female workers? And how does the exclusion of women from the sphere of socially recognized work and monetary relations relate to the imposition of forced maternity upon them and the contemporary massification of the witch hunt? Looking at these phenomena from the vantage point of the present, after 4 centuries of capitalist disciplining of women, the answers may seem to impose themselves. Though women's waged work, housework, and paid sexual work are still studied all too often in isolation from each other, we are now in a better position to see that the discrimination that women have suffered in the waged workforce has been directly rooted in their function as unpaid laborers in the home. We can thus connect the banning of prostitution and the expulsion of women from the organized workplace with the creation of the housewife and the reconstruction of the family as the locus for the production of labor power. However, from a theoretical and political viewpoint, the fundamental question is under what conditions such degradation was possible and what social forces promoted it or were complicitous with it. The answer here is that an important factor in the devaluation of women's labor was the campaign that craft workers mounted, starting in the late 15th century, to exclude female workers from their workshops, presumably to protect themselves from the assaults of the capitalist merchants who were employing women at cheaper rates. The craftsmen's efforts have led an abundant trail of evidence. Whether in Italy, France, or Germany, journeymen petitioned the authorities not to allow women to compete with them, banned them from their ranks, went on strike when the ban was not observed, and even refused to work with men who worked with women. It appears that the craftsmen were also interested in limiting women to domestic work because, given their economic difficulties, quote, the prudent household management on the part of a wife was becoming for them an indispensable condition for avoiding bankruptcy and for keeping an independent shop. Sigrid Brauner, the author of the above citation, speaks of the importance accorded to the German artisans to this social rule. Women tried to resist this onslaught, but faced with the intimidating tactics male workers used against them, failed. Those who dared to work out of the home in a public space and for the market were portrayed as sexually aggressive shrews or even as, quote, whores or, quote, witches. Indeed, there is evidence that the wave of misogyny that by the late 15th century was mounting in the European cities, reflected in the male obsession with the, quote, battle for the breeches, and with the character of the disobedient wife pictured in the popular literature in the act of beating her husband or riding on his back, emanated also from the self-defeating attempt to drive women from the workplace and from the market. On the other hand, it is clear that this attempt would not have succeeded if the authorities had not cooperated with it. but they obviously saw that it was in their interest to do so. For in addition to pacifying the rebellious journeymen, the displacement of women from the crafts provided the necessary basis for their fixation in reproductive labor and their utilization as low-waged workers in cottage industry. Subhead: Women, the New Commons, and the Substitute for the Lost Land. It was from this alliance between the crafts and the urban authorities, along with the continuing privatization of land, that a new sexual division of labor, or better, a new sexual contract, in Carol Patesman's words, was forged, defining women in terms, mothers, wives, daughters, widows, that hid their status as workers, while giving men free access to women's bodies, their labor, and the bodies and labor of their children. According to this new social sexual contract, proletarian women became for male workers the substitute for the land lost to the enclosures, their most basic means of reproduction, and a communal good anyone could appropriate and use at will. Echoes of this primitive appropriation can be heard in the concept of the, quote, common woman, which in the 16th century qualified those who prostituted themselves. But in the new organization of work, every woman, other than those privatized by bourgeois men, became a communal good. For once women's activities were defined as non-work, women's labor began to appear as a natural resource, available to all, no less than the air we breathe or the water we drink. This was for women a historic defeat. With their expulsion from the crafts and the devaluation of reproductive labor, poverty became feminized, and to enforce men's, quote, primary appropriation of women's labor, a new patriarchal order was constructed, reducing women to a double dependence, on employers and on men. The fact that unequal power relations between women and men existed even prior to the advent of capitalism, as did a discriminating sexual division of labor, does not detract from this assessment. For in pre-capitalist Europe, women's subordination to men had been tempered by the fact that they had access to the commons and other communal assets, while in the new capitalist regime, women themselves became the commons, as their work was defined as a natural resource lying outside the sphere of market relations. Subhead: The Patriarchy of the Wage. Significant in this context are the changes that took place within the family, which in this period began to separate from the public sphere and acquire its modern connotations as the main center for the reproduction of the workforce. The counterpart of the market, the instrument for the privatization of social relations, and above all for the propagation of capitalist discipline and patriarchal rule, the family emerges in a period of primitive accumulation, also as the most important institution for the appropriation and concealment of women's labor. We see this in particular when we look at the working class family. This is a subject that has been understudied. Previous discussions have privileged the family of propertied men, plausibly because at the time to which we are referring, it was the dominant form and the model for parental and marital relations. There has also been more interest in the family as a political institution than as a place of work. What has been emphasized then is that in the new bourgeois family, the husband became the representative of the state, charged with disciplining and supervising the, quote, subordinate classes, a category that for 16th and 17th century political theorists included the man's wife and his children. Thus, the identification of the family as a microstate or a microchurch, and the demand by the authorities that single workers live under the roof and rule of a master. It also pointed out that within the bourgeois family, the woman lost most of her power, being generally excluded from the family business and confined to the supervision of the household. But what is missing in this picture is a recognition that while in the upper class it was property that gave the husband power over his wife and children, a similar power was granted to working class men over women by means of women's exclusion from the wage. Exemplary of this trend was the family of the cottage workers in the putting out system. Far from shunning marriage and family making, male cottage workers depended on it, for a wife could, quote, help them with the work they would do for the merchants while caring for their physical needs and providing them with children, who from an early age could be employed at the loom or in some subsidiary occupation. Thus, even in times of population decline, cottage workers apparently continued to multiply. Their families were so large that a contemporary 17th century Austrian, looking at those living in his village, described them as packed in their homes like sparrows on a rafter. What stands out in this type of arrangement is though the wife worked side by side with her husband, she too producing for the market, it was the husband who now received her wage. This was true also for other female workers once they married in England. A married man was legally entitled to his wife's earnings even when the job she did was nursing or breastfeeding. Thus, when a parish employed women to do this kind of job, the records, quote, frequently hid their presence as workers, close quote, registering the payment made in the men's names. Whether the payment was made to the husband or to the wife depended on the whim of the clerk. This policy, making it possible for women to have money of their own, created the material conditions for making it impossible for women to have money of their own, created the material conditions for their subjection to men and the appropriation of their labor by male workers. It is in this sense that I speak of the patriarchy of the wage. We must also rethink the concept of, quote, wage slavery. If it is true that male workers become only formally free under the new wage labor regime, the group of workers who in the transition to capitalism most approached the condition of slaves was working class women. At the same time, given the wretched conditions in which wage workers lived, the housework that women performed to reproduce their families was necessarily limited. Married or not, proletarian women needed to earn some money, which they did by holding multiple jobs. Housework, moreover, requires some reproductive capital, furniture, utensils, clothing, money for food. But waged workers lived poorly, slaving away by day and night, as an artisan from Nuremberg denounced in 1524, just to stave off hunger and feed their wives and children. Most barely had a roof over their heads, living in huts where other families and animals also resided, and where hygiene, poorly observed even among the better off, was totally lacking. Their clothes were rags, their diet at best consisted of bread, cheese, and some vegetables. Thus, we do not find in this period among the working class the classic figure of the full-time housewife. It was only in the 19th century, in response to the first intense cycle of struggle against industrial work, that the, quote, modern family centered on the full-time housewife's unpaid reductive labor was generalized in the working class, in England first and later in the United States. Its development, following the passage of factory acts limiting the employment of women and children in the factories, reflected the first long-term investment the capitalist class made in the reproduction of the workforce beyond its numerical expansion. It was the result of a trade-off, forged under the threat of insurrection, between the granting of higher wages, capable of supporting a, quote, non-working wife, and a more intensive rate of exploitation. Marx spoke of it as a shift from, quote, absolute to, quote, relative surplus. That is, a shift from a type of exploitation based upon the lengthening of the working day to a lengthening of the working day to a maximum and the reduction of the wage to a minimum, to a regime where higher wages and shorter hours would be compensated with an increase in the productivity of work and the pace of production. From the capitalist perspective, it was a social revolution overriding a long-held commitment to low wages. It resulted from a deal between workers and employers, again founded on the exclusion of women from the wage, putting an end to their recruitment in the early phases of the Industrial Revolution. It was also the mark of a new capitalist affluence, the product of 2 centuries of exploitation of slave labor, soon to be boosted by a new phase of colonial expansion. In the 15th and 17th centuries, by contrast, Despite an obsessive concern with the size of population and the number of, quote, working poor, the actual investment in the reproduction of the workforce was extremely low. Consequently, the bulk of the reproductive labor done by proletarian women was not for their families, but for the families of their employers or for the market. 1/3 of the female population on average in England, Spain, France, and Italy worked as maids. Thus, in the proletariat, the tendency was towards the postponement of marriage and the disintegration of the family. 16th century English villages experienced a yearly turnover of 50%. Often the poor were even forbidden to marry when it was feared that their children would fall on public relief, and when this actually happened, the children were taken away from them and farmed out to the parish to work. It is estimated that 1/3 or more of the population of rural Europe remained single. In the towns, the rates were even higher, especially among women. In Germany, 40% were either, quote, spinsters or widows. Nevertheless, though the housework done by proletarian women was reduced to a minimum, and proletarian women always had to work for the market, within the working class community of the transition period, we already see the emergence of the sexual division of labor that was to become typical of the capitalist organization of work. At its center was an increasing differentiation between male and female labor, as the tasks performed by women and men became more diversified and above all became the carriers of different social relations. Impoverished and disempowered as they may be, male-waged workers could still benefit from their wives' labor and wages, or they could buy the services of prostitutes. Throughout this first phase of proletarianization, it was the prostitute who often performed for male workers the function of a wife, cooking and washing for them in addition to serving them sexually. Moreover, the criminalization of prostitution, which punished the woman but hardly touched her male customers, strengthened male power. Any man could now destroy a woman simply by declaring that she was a prostitute, or by publicizing that she had given in to his sexual desires. Women would have to plead with men, quote, not to take away their honor, the only property left to them. The assumption being that their lives were now in the hands of men who, like feudal lords, could exercise over them a power of life and death. Subhead: The taming of women and the redefinition of femininity and masculinity. Women, the savages of Europe. It is not surprising, then, in view of this devaluation of women's labor and social status, that the subordination of women and the methods by which they could be tamed were among the main themes in the literature and social policy of the transition. Women could not have been totally devalued as workers and deprived of autonomy with respect to men without being subjected to an intense process of social degradation. And indeed, through the 16th and 17th centuries, women lost ground in every area of social life. A key area of change in this respect was the law, where in this period we can observe a steady erosion of women's rights. One of the main rights that women lost was the right to conduct economic activities alone, as femmes seules. In France, they lost the right to make contracts or to represent themselves in court, being declared legal imbeciles. In Italy, they began to appear less frequently in the courts to denounce abuses perpetrated against them. In Germany, when a middle-class woman became a widow, it became customary to appoint a tutor to manage her affairs. German women were also forbidden to live alone or with other women, and in the case of the poor, even with their own families, since it was expected that they could not be properly controlled. In sum, together with economic and social devaluation, women experienced a process of legal infantilization. Women's loss of social power was also expressed through a new sexual differentiation of space. In the Mediterranean countries, women were expelled not only from many wage jobs, but also from the streets, where an unaccompanied woman risked being subjected to ridicule or sexual assault. In England, too, quote, a woman's paradise in the eyes of some Italian visitors, The presence of women in public began to be frowned upon. English women were discouraged from sitting in front of their homes or staying near their windows. They were also instructed not to spend time with their female friends. In this period, the term gossip, female friend, began to acquire a disparaging connotation. It was even recommended that women should not visit their parents too often after marriage. How the new sexual division of labor reshaped male-female relations can be seen from the broad debate that was carried out in the learned and popular literature on the nature of female virtues and vices, one of the main avenues for the ideological redefinition of gender relations in the transition to capitalism. Known from an early phase as La Querelle des Femmes, which transpires from this debate, is a new sense of curiosity for the subject, indicating that old norms were breaking down, and the public was becoming aware that the basic elements of sexual politics were being reconstructed. Two trends within this debate can be identified. On the one hand, new cultural canons were constructed, maximizing the differences between women and men, and creating more feminine and more masculine prototypes. On the other hand, it was established that women were inherently inferior to men, excessively emotional and lusty, unable to govern themselves, and had to be placed under male control. As with the condemnation of witchcraft, consensus on this matter cut across religious and intellectual lines. From the pulpit or the written page, humanists, Protestant reformers, Counter-Reformation Catholics all cooperated in the vilification of women constantly and obsessively. Women were accused of being unreasonable, vain, wild, wasteful. Especially blamed was the female tongue, seen as an instrument of insubordination. But the main female villain was the disobedient wife, who together with the quote scold, the quote witch, and the quote whore, was the favorite target of dramatists, popular writers, and moralists. In this sense, Shakespeare's The Taming of the Shrew was the manifesto of the age. The punishment of female insubordination to patriarchal authority was called for and celebrated in countless misogynist plays and tracts. English literature of the Elizabethan and Jacobean period feasted on such themes. Typical of this genre is John Ford's "'Tis a Pity She's a Whore," 1633, which ends with the didactic assassination, execution, and murder of 3 of the 4 female characters. Other classic works concerned with the disciplining of women are Joseph Swetnam's The Arraignment of Lewd, Idle, Forward, Inconstant Women, 1615, and The Parliament of Women, 1646, a satire primarily addressed against middle-class women, which portrays them as busy making laws in order to gain supremacy over their husbands. Meanwhile, new laws and new forms of torture were introduced to control women's behavior in and out of the home, confirming that the literary denigration of women expressed a precise political project aiming to strip them of any autonomy and social power. In the Europe of the Age of Reason, the women accused of being scolds were muzzled like dogs and paraded in the streets. Prostitutes were whipped or caged and subjected to fake drownings, while capital punishment was established for women convicted of adultery. It is no exaggeration to say that women were treated with the same hostility and sense of estrangement accorded, quote, Indian savages in the literature that developed on this subject after the conquest. The parallel is not casual. In both cases, literary and cultural denigration was at the service of a project of expropriation. As we will see, the demonization of the American indigenous people served to justify their enslavement and the plunder of their resources. In Europe, the attack waged on women justified the appropriation of their labor by men and the criminalization of their control over reproduction. Always, the price of resistance was extermination. None of the tactics deployed against European women and colonial subjects would have succeeded had they not been sustained by a campaign of terror. In the case of the European women, it was the witch hunt that played the main role in the construction of their new social function and the degradation of their social identity. The definition of women as demonic beings and the atrocious and humiliating practices to which so many of them were subjected left indelible marks in the collective female psyche and in women's sense of possibilities. From every viewpoint, socially, economically, culturally, politically, the witch hunt was a turning point in women's lives. It was the equivalent of the historic defeat to which Engels alludes in The Origin of the Family, Private Property, and the State as the cause of the downfall of the matriarchal world. For the witch hunt destroyed a whole world of female practices, collective relations, and systems of knowledge that had been the foundation of women's power in pre-capitalist Europe and the condition for their resistance in the struggle against feudalism. Out of this defeat, a new model of femininity emerged, the ideal woman and wife, passive, obedient, thrifty, of few words, always busy at work, and chaste. This change began at the end of the 17th century, after women had been subjected for more than 2 centuries to state terrorism. Once women were defeated, the image of femininity constructed in the, quote, transition was discarded as an unnecessary tool, and a new tamed one took its place. While at the time of the witch hunt, women had been portrayed as savage beings, mentally weak, unsatiably lusty, rebellious, insubordinate, incapable of self-control, by the 18th century, the canon has been reversed. Women were now depicted as passive, asexual beings, more obedient, more moral than men, capable of exerting a positive moral influence on them. Even their irrationality could now be valorized, as the Dutch philosopher Pierre Bayle realized in his Dictionnaire historique et critique, 1740, in which he praised the power of the female, quote, maternal instinct, arguing that it should be viewed as a truly providential device, ensuring that despite the disadvantages of childbirthing and child raising, women do continue to reproduce. Subhead: Colonization, Globalization, and Women. While the response to the population crisis in Europe was the subjugation of women to reproduction, in colonial America, where colonization destroyed 95% of the Aboriginal population, the response was the slave trade, which delivered to the European working class an immense quantity of labor power. As early as the 16th century, approximately 1 million slaves and indigenous workers were producing surplus value for Spain in colonial America, at a rate of exploitation far higher than that of workers in Europe, and contributing to sectors of the European economy that were developing in a capitalist direction. By 1600, Brazil alone exported twice the value in sugar of all the wool that England exported in the same year. The accumulation rate was so high in the Brazilian sugar plantations that every 2 years they doubled their capacity. Gold and silver, too, played a key role in the solution to the capitalist crisis. Gold imported from Brazil reactivated commerce and industry in Europe. More than 17,000 tons were imported by 1640, giving the capitalist class there an exceptional advantage in access to workers, commodities, and land. But the true wealth was the labor accumulated through the slave trade, which made possible a mode of production that could not be imposed in Europe. It is now established that the plantation system fueled the Industrial Revolution, as argued by Eric Williams, who noted that hardly a brick in Liverpool and Bristol was not cemented with African blood. But capitalism may not even have taken off without Europe's annexation of America and the blood and sweat that for 2 centuries flowed to Europe from the plantations. This must be stressed, as it helps us realize how essential slavery has been for the history of capitalism, and why periodically but systematically, whenever the capitalist system is threatened by a major economic crisis, the capitalist class has to launch a process of primitive accumulation. That is, a process of large-scale colonization and enslavement, such as the one we are witnessing at present. The plantation system was crucial for capitalist development, not only because of the immense amount of surplus labor that was accumulated from it, but because it set a model of labor management, export-oriented production, economic integration, and international division of labor that have since become paradigmatic for capitalist class relations. With its immense concentration of workers, and its captive labor force uprooted from its homeland, unable to rely on local support, the plantation prefigured not only the factory, but also the later use of immigration and globalization to cut the cost of labor. In particular, the plantation was a key step in the formation of an international division of labor that, through the production of, quote, consumer goods, integrated the work of the slaves into the reproduction of the European workforce, while keeping enslaved and waged workers geographically and socially divided. The colonial production of sugar, tea, tobacco, rum, and cotton, the most important commodities together with bread in the production of labor power in Europe, did not take off on a large scale until after the 1650s, after slavery had been institutionalized and wages in Europe had begun to modestly rise. It must be mentioned here, however, because when it did take off, two mechanisms were introduced that significantly restructured the reproduction of labor internationally. On one side, a global assembly line was created that cut the cost of the commodities necessary to produce labor power in Europe and linked enslaved and waged workers in ways that prefigured capitalism's present use of Asian, African, and Latin American workers as providers of, quote, cheap consumer goods, cheapened by death squads and military violence, for the advanced capitalist countries. On the other side, the metropolitan wage became the vehicle by which the goods produced by enslaved workers went to the market, and the value of the products of enslaved labor was realized. In this way, as with female domestic work, the integration of enslaved labor into the production and reproduction of the metropolitan workforce was further established, and the wage was further defined as an instrument of accumulation, that is, a lever for mobilizing not only the labor of the workers paid by it, but also for the labor of a multitude of workers hidden by it because of the unwaged conditions of their work. Did workers in Europe know that they were buying products resulting from slave labor? And if they did they object to it? This is a question we would like to ask them, but it's one which I cannot answer. What is certain is that the history of tea, sugar, rum, tobacco, and cotton is far more significant than we can deduce from the contribution which these commodities made as raw materials or means of exchange in the slave trade to the rise of the factory system. What traveled with these, quote, exports was not only the blood of the slaves, but the seeds of a new science of exploitation and a new division of the working class, by which waged work, rather than providing an alternative to slavery, was made to depend on it for its existence, as a means, like female unpaid labor, for the expansion of the unpaid part of the waged working day. So closely integrated were the lives of the enslaved laborers in America and waged laborers in Europe that in the Caribbean islands, where slaves were given plots of land, provision grounds, to cultivate for their own use, how much land was allotted to them and how much time was given to them to cultivate it varied in proportion to the price of sugar on the world market, plausibly determined by the dynamics of workers' wages and workers' struggle over reproduction. It would be a mistake, however, to conclude that the integration of slave labor in the production of the European waged proletariat created a community of interest between European workers and the metropolitan capitalists, presumably cemented by their common desire for cheap imported goods. In reality, like the conquest, the slave trade was an epochal misfortune for European workers. As we have seen, slavery, like the witch hunt, was a major ground of experimentation for methods of labor control that were later imported into Europe. Slavery also affected the European workers' wages and legal status, for it cannot be a coincidence that only with the end of slavery did wages in Europe decisively increase and did European workers gain the right to organize. It's also hard to imagine that workers in Europe profited from the conquest of America, at least in its initial phase. Let us remember that it was the intensity of the anti-feudal struggle that instigated the lesser nobility and the merchants to seek colonial expansion, and that the conquistadors came from the ranks of the most hated enemies of the European working class. It is also important to remember that the conquest provided the European ruling class with the silver and gold used to pay the mercenary armies that defeated the urban and rural revolts, and that in the same years when Arawaks, Aztecs, and Incas were being subjugated, workers in Europe were being driven from their homes, branded like animals, and burnt as witches. We should not assume, then, that the European proletariat was always an accomplice to the plunder of the Americas, though individual proletarians undoubtedly were. The nobility expected so little cooperation from the quote lower classes that initially the Spaniards allowed only a few to embark. Only 8,000 Spaniards migrated legally to the Americans in the entire 16th century, the clergy making up 17% of the lot. Even later, people were forbidden from settling overseas independently because it was feared they might collaborate with the local population. For most proletarians in the 17th and 18th centuries, access to the New World was through indentured servitude and, quote, transportation, the punishment which the authorities in England adopted to rid the country of convicts, political and religious dissidents, and the vast population of vagabonds and beggars that was produced by the enclosures. As Peter Linebaugh and Marcus Rediker point out in The Many-Headed Hydra, 2000, the colonizers' fear of unrestricted migration was well-founded, given the wretched living conditions that prevailed in Europe and the appeal exercised by the reports that circulated about the New World, which pictured it as a wonderland where people lived free from toil and tyranny, masters and greed, and where mine and thine had no place, all things being held in common. So strong was the attraction exercised by the New World that the vision of a new society it provided apparently influenced the political thought of the Enlightenment, contributing to the emergence of a new concept of, quote, liberty, taken to signify masterlessness, an idea previously unknown in European political theory. Not surprisingly, some Europeans tried to lose themselves in this utopian world, where, as Linebaugh and Rediker powerfully put it, they could reconstruct the lost experience of the commons. Some lived for years with Indian tribes despite the restrictions placed on those who settled in the American colonies and the heavy price to be paid if caught, since escapees were treated like traitors and put to death. This was the fate of some young English settlers in Virginia who, having run away to live with the Indians, on being caught were condemned by the colony's councilmen to be, quote, burned, broken on the wheel, hanged, or shot to death. Terror created boundaries, Linebaugh and Rediker comment. Yet as late as 1699, the English still had a great difficulty persuading the people whom the Indians had captivated to leave their Indian manner of living. No argument, no treaties, no tears, a contemporary reported, could persuade many of them to leave their Indian friends. On the other hand, Indian children have been carefully educated among the English, clothed and caught, yet there is not one instance that any of those would remain, but return to their own nations. As for the European proletarians who signed themselves away into indentured servitude or arrived in the New World in consequence of a penal sentence, their lot was not too different at first from that of the African slaves with whom they often worked side by side. Their hostility to their masters was equally intense, so that the planters viewed them as a dangerous lot, and by the second half of the 17th century began to limit their use and introduce a legislation aimed at separating them from the Africans. But only at the end of the 18th century were racial boundaries irrevocably drawn. Until then, the possibility of alliances between whites, blacks, and Aboriginal peoples, and the fear of such unity in the European working class imagination at home and on the plantations, was constantly present. Shakespeare gave voice to it in The Tempest, where he pictured the conspiracy organized by Caliban, the native rebel, son of a witch, and by Trinculo and Stefano, the ocean-going European proletarians, suggesting the possibility of a fatal alliance among the oppressed and providing a dramatic counterpoint to Prospero's magic healing of the discord among the rulers. In The Tempest, the conspiracy ends ignominiously, with the European proletarians demonstrating to be nothing better than petty thieves and drunkards, and with Caliban begging forgiveness from his colonial master. Thus, when the defeated rebels are brought in front of Prospero and his former enemies Sebastian and Antonio, now reconciled with him, they are met with derision and thoughts of ownership and division. Sebastian: "What things are these, my lord Antonio? Will money buy them?" Antonio: "Very like. One of them is a plain fish, and no doubt marketable." Prospero: "Mark but the badges of these men, my lords, then say if they be true. This misshapen knave, his mother was a witch, and one so strong that could control the moon, make flows and ebbs, and deal in her command without her power. These three have robbed me, and this demi-devil, for he's a bastard one, had plotted with them to take my life. Two of these fellows you must know and own. This thing of darkness I acknowledge mine." Offstage, however, the threat continued. Quote, "Both on Bermuda and Barbados, white servants were discovered plotting with African slaves, as thousands of convicts were being shipped there in the 1650s from the British Islands." Close quote. In Virginia, the peak in the alliance between black and white servants was Bacon's Rebellion of 1675 to 76, when African slaves and British indentured servants joined together to conspire against their masters. It is for this reason that starting in the 1640s, the accumulation of an enslaved proletariat in the Southern American colonies and the Caribbean was accompanied by the construction of racial hierarchies, thwarting the possibility of such combinations. Laws were passed depriving Africans of previously granted civic rights, such as citizenship, the right to bear arms, and the right to make depositions or seek redress in a tribunal for injuries suffered. The turning point was when slavery was made an hereditary condition, and the slave masters were given the right to beat and kill their slaves. In addition, marriages between, quote, blacks and, quote, whites were forbidden. Later, after the American War of Independence, white indentured servitude, deemed a vestige of British rule, was eliminated. As a result, by the late 18th century, colonial America had moved from, quote, a society with slaves to a slave society, and the possibility of solidarity between Africans and whites had been severely undermined. Quote, white in the colonies became not just a badge of social and economic privilege, quote, serving to designate those who until 1650 had been called Christians and afterwards English or freemen, but a moral attribute, a means by which social hegemony was naturalized. Black, or African by contrast, became synonymous with slave, so much so that free black people, still a sizable presence in early 17th century America, were later forced to prove that they were free. Subhead: Sex, Race, and Class in the Colonies. Would Caliban's conspiracy have had a different outcome had its protagonists been women? Had the instigators been not Caliban, but his mother Sycorax, the powerful Algerian witch that Shakespeare hides in the play's background, and not Trinculo and Stefano, but the sisters of the witches who, in the same years of the conquest, were being burned in Europe at the stake? This question is a theoretical one, but it serves to question the nature of the sexual division of labor in the colonies and of the bonds that could be established there between European indigenous and African women by virtue of a common experience of sexual discrimination. In I, Tituba, Black Witch of Salem, Maurice Condé gives us an insight into the kind of situation that could produce such bonding by describing how Tituba and her new mistress, the Puritan Samuel Parris's young wife, gave each other support at first against his murderous contempt for women. An even more outstanding example comes from the Caribbean, where low-class English women were, quote, transported from Britain as convicts or indentured servants, became a significant part of the labor gangs on the sugar estates. Considered unfit for marriage by propertied white males and disqualified for domestic service because of their insolence and riotous disposition, quote, landless white women were dismissed to manual labor in plantations, public construction works, and the urban service sector. In these worlds, they socialized intimately with the slave community and with enslaved black men. They established households and had children with them. They also cooperated as well as competed with female slaves in the marketing of produce or stolen goods. But with the institutionalization of slavery, which was accompanied by lessening of the burden for white workers and a decrease in the number of women arriving from Europe as wives for the planters, the situation changed drastically. Regardless of their social origin, white women were upgraded or married off within the ranks of the white power structure, and whenever possible, they became owners of slaves themselves, usually female ones, employed for domestic work. This, however, was not an automatic process. Like sexism, racism had to be legislated and enforced. Among the most revealing prohibitions, we must again count that marriage and sexual relations between blacks and whites were forbidden, white women who married black slaves were condemned, and the children resulting from such marriages were enslaved for life. Passed in Maryland and Virginia in the 1660s, these laws proved that a segregated racist society was instituted from above, and that intimate relations between, quote, blacks and, quote, whites must have been very common indeed if life enslavement was deemed necessary to terminate them. As if following the script laid out by the witch hunt, the new laws demonized the relation between white women and black men. When they were passed in the 1660s, the witch hunt in Europe was coming to an end. But in America, all the taboos surrounding the witch and the black devil were being revived, this time at the expense of black men. Divide and rule also became official policy in the Spanish colonies, after a period when the numerical inferiority of the colonists recommended a more liberal attitude towards inter-ethnic relations and alliances with the local chiefs through marriage. But in the 1540s, as the increase in the number of mestizos was undermining colonial privilege, quote, race was established as a key factor in the transmission of property, and a racial hierarchy was put in place to separate indigenous mestizos and mulattoes from each other and from the white population. Prohibitions relating to marriage and female sexuality served here, too, to enforce social exclusion. But in Spanish America, segregation along racial lines succeeded only in part, checked by migration, population decline, indigenous revolt, and the formation of a white urban proletariat with no prospect of economic advancement, and therefore prone to identify with mestizos and mulattoes more than with the white upper class. Thus, while in the plantation societies of the Caribbean, the differences between European and Africans increased with time, in the South American colonies, a, quote, recomposition became possible, especially among lower-class European, mestiza, and African women, who, besides their precarious economic position, shared the disadvantages deriving from the double standard built into the law, which made them vulnerable to male abuse. Signs of this, quote, recomposition can be found in the records which the Inquisition kept in 18th century Mexico of the investigations it conducted to eradicate magical and heretic beliefs. The task was hopeless, and soon the Inquisition lost interest in the project, convinced that popular magic was no longer a threat to the political order. But the testimonies it collected revealed the existence of multiple exchanges among women in matters relating to magical cures and love remedies, creating in time a new cultural reality drawn from the encounter between the African European and indigenous magical traditions. As Ruth Bahar writes, Indian women gave hummingbirds to Spanish healers for use in sexual attraction. Mulatto women told mestizo women how to tame their husbands. A loba sorceress introduced a coyote to the devil. This popular system of belief ran parallel to the system of belief of the church, and it spread as quickly as Christianity did in the New World, so that after a while it became impossible to distinguish in it what was, quote, Indian, or, quote, Spanish, or, quote, African. Assimilated in the eyes of the Inquisition as people, quote, without reason, this variegated female world, which Ruth Behar describes, is a telling example of the alliances that across colonial and color lines women could build by virtue of their common experience and their interest in sharing the traditional knowledges and practices available to them to control their reproduction and fight sexual discrimination. Like discrimination on the basis of, quote, race, this was more than a cultural baggage which the colonizers brought from Europe with their pikes and horses. No less than the destruction of communalism, it was a strategy dictated by specific economic interest and the need to create the preconditions for a capitalist economy, and as such, always adjusted to the task at hand. In Mexico and Peru, where population decline recommended that female domestic labor in the home be incentivized, a new sexual hierarchy was introduced by the Spanish authorities that stripped indigenous women of their autonomy and gave their male kin more power over them. Under the new laws, married women became men's property and were forced, against the traditional custom, to follow their husbands to their homes. A compadrazgo system was also created, further limiting their rights, placing the authority over children in male hands. In addition, to ensure that indigenous women reproduced the workers required to do mita work in the mines, the Spanish authorities legislated that no one could separate husband from wife, which meant that women were forced to follow their husbands whether they wanted to or not, even to areas known to be death camps due to the pollution created by the mining. The intervention of the French Jesuits in the disciplining and training of the Montagnais Naskapi in mid-17th century Canada provides a revealing example of how gender differences were accumulated. The story is told by the late anthropologist Eleanor Leacock in her Myths of Male Dominance, 1981, where she examines the diary of one of its protagonists. This was Father Paul Lejeune, a Jesuit missionary who, in typical colonial fashion, had joined a French trading post to Christianize the Indians and turn them into citizens of New France. The Montagnais Naskapi were a nomadic Indian nation that had lived in great harmony, hunting and fishing in the eastern Labrador Peninsula. But by the time of Lejeune's arrival, their community was being undermined by the presence of Europeans and the spread of fur trading, so that some men, eager to strike a commercial alliance with them, were amenable to letting the French dictate how they should govern themselves. As often happened when Europeans came in contact with Native American populations, the French were impressed by Montagnais Naskapi generosity, their sense of cooperation and indifference to status, but they were scandalized by their, quote, lack of morals. They saw that the Naskapi had no conception of private property, of authority, of male superiority, and they even refused to punish their children. The Jesuits decided to change all that, setting out to teach the Indians the basic elements of civilization, convinced that this was necessary to turn them into reliable trade partners. In this spirit, they first taught them that man is the master, that in France women do not rule their husbands, and that courting by night, divorce at either partner's desire, and sexual freedom for both spouses before or after marriage had to be forgiven. Here's a telling exchange Lejeune had on that score with a Naskapi man. I told him it was not honorable for a woman to love anyone else except her husband, and that this evil being among them, he himself was not sure that his son, who was present, was his son. He replied, "Thou hast no sense. You French people love only your children, but we love all the children of our tribe." I began to laugh, seeing that he philosophized in horse and mule fashion. Backed by the governor of New France, the Jesuits succeeded in convincing the Naskapi to provide themselves with some chiefs and bring, quote, their women to order. Typically, one weapon they used was to insinuate that women who were too independent and did not obey their husbands were creatures of the devil. When angered by the men's attempts to subdue them, the Naskapi women ran away, the Jesuits persuaded the men to chase after their spouses and threaten them with imprisonment. Such acts of justice, Lejeune proudly commented in one particular case, caused no surprise in France, because it is usual there to proceed in that manner. But among those people, where everyone considers himself from birth as free as the wild animals that roam in the great forests, it is a marvel, or rather a miracle, to see a peremptory command obeyed or any act of severity or justice performed. The Jesuits' greatest victory, however, was persuading the Nascavi to beat their children, believing that the savages' excessive fondness for their offspring was the major obstacle to their Christianization. Lejeune's diary records the first instance in which a girl was publicly beaten, while one of her relatives gave a chilling lecture to the bystanders on the historic significance of the event. Quote, "This is the first punishment by beating," he said, "we inflict on anyone of our nation." The Montagnais Nascapi men owed their training in male supremacy to the fact that the French wanted to instill in them the, quote, "instinct for private property," to induce them to become reliable partners in the fur trade. Very different was the situation on the plantations, where the sexual division of labor was immediately dictated by the planters' requirements for labor power and by the price of commodities produced by the slaves on the international market. Until the abolition of the slave trade, as Barbara Bush and Marietta Morrissey have documented, both women and men were subjected to the same degree of exploitation. The planters found it more profitable to work and, quote, "consume slaves to death" than to encourage their reproduction. Neither the sexual division of labor nor sexual hierarchies were thus pronounced. African men had no say concerning the destiny of their female companions and kin, and as for women, far from being given special consideration, they were expected to work in the fields like men, especially when sugar and tobacco were in high demand, and they were subject to the same cruel punishments, even when pregnant. Ironically, then, it would seem that in slavery, women, quote, "achieved a rough equality with the men of their class," but their treatment was never the same. Women were given less to eat. Unlike men, they were vulnerable to their masters' sexual assaults, and more cruel punishment were inflicted on them. For in addition to the physical agony, women had to bear the sexual humiliation, always attached to them, and the damage done when pregnant to the fetuses they carried. A new page, moreover, opened after 1807, when the slave trade was abolished and the Caribbean and American planters adopted a slave breeding policy. As Hilary Beckles points out in relation to the island of Barbados, plantation owners had attempted to control the reproductive patterns of female slaves since the 17th century, quote, "encouraging them to have fewer or more children in any given span of time, depending on how much field labor was needed. But only when the supply of African slaves diminished did the regulation of women's sexual relations and reproductive patterns become more systematic and intense." In Europe, forcing women to procreate had led to the imposition of capital punishment for contraception. In the plantations, where slaves were becoming a precious commodity, the shift to a breeding policy made women more vulnerable to sexual assault, though it led to some, quote, "ameliorations of women's work conditions, a reduction of work hours, the building of lying-in houses, the provision of midwives assisting the delivery, and expansion of social rights, for instance, of travel and assembly." But these changes could not reduce the damages inflicted on women by field labor, nor the bitterness women experienced because of their lack of freedom. With the exception of Barbados, the planters' attempt to expand the workforce through, quote, "natural reproduction" failed, and the birth rates on the plantations remained abnormally low. Whether this phenomenon was a result of outright resistance to the perpetuation of slavery or a consequence of the physical debilitation produced by the harsh conditions to which enslaved women were subjected is still a matter of debate. But as Bush points out, there are good reasons to believe that the main cause of the failure was the refusal of women to procreate. For as soon as slavery was eradicated, even when their economic conditions in some respects deteriorated, the communities of freed slaves began to grow. Women's refusals of victimization also reshaped the sexual division of labor, as occurred in Caribbean islands where enslaved women turned themselves into semi-free market vendors of the products that they cultivated in the, quote, provision grounds in Jamaica, Polinks, given by the planters to the slaves so that they could support themselves. The planters adopted this measure to save on the cost of reproducing labor. But access to the provision grounds turned out to be advantageous for the slaves as well. It gave them more mobility and the possibility to use the time allotted for their cultivation for other activities. Being able to produce small crops that could be eaten or sold boosted their independence. Those most devoted to the success of the provision grounds were women, who marketed the crops, reappropriating and reproducing within the plantation system what had been one of their main occupations in Africa. As a result, by the mid-18th century, enslaved women in the Caribbean had carved out for themselves a place in the plantation economy, contributing to the expansion, if not the creation, of the island's food market. They did so both as producers of much of the food consumed by the slaves and the white population, and also as hucksters and market vendors of the crops they cultivated, supplemented with goods taken from the master's shop or exchanged with other slaves or given to them for sale by their masters. It was in this capacity that female slaves also came into contact with white proletarian women, often former indentured servants, even after the latter had been removed from gang labor and emancipated. Their relationship at times could be hostile. Proletarian European women, who also survived mostly through the growing and marketing of food crops, stole at times the products that slave women brought to the market or attempted to impede their sales. But both groups of women also collaborated in building a vast network of buying and selling relations, which evaded the laws passed by the colonial authorities, who periodically worried that these activities may place slaves beyond their control. Despite the legislation introduced to prevent them from selling or limiting the places in which they could do so, enslaved women continued to expand their marketing activities and the cultivation of their provision plots, which they came to view as their own, so that by the late 18th century, they were forming a proto-peasantry with practically a monopoly of island markets. Thus, according to some historians, even before emancipation, slavery in the Caribbean had practically ended. Female slaves, against all odds, were a key force in this process, the ones who, with their determination, shaped the development of the slave community and of the island's economies, despite the authorities' many attempts to limit their power. Enslaved Caribbean women had also a decisive impact on the culture of the white population, especially that of white women, through their activities as healers, seers, experts in magical practices, and their, quote, domination of the kitchens and bedrooms of their masters. Not surprisingly, they were seen as the heart of the slave community. Visitors were impressed by their singing, their headkerchiefs and dresses, and their extravagant manner of speaking, which are now understood as a means of satirizing their masters. African and Creole women influenced the customs of poor female whites, whom a contemporary portrayed as behaving like Africans, walking with their children strapped on their hips, while balancing trays with goods on their heads. But their main achievement was the development of a politics of self-reliance, grounded in survival strategies and female networks. These practices and the values attached to them, which Rosalind Terburg Penn has identified as the essential tenets of contemporary African feminism, redefined the African community of the diaspora. They created not only the foundations for a new female African identity, but also the foundations for a new society committed against the capitalist attempt to impose scarcity and dependence as structural conditions of life, to the reappropriation and concentration in women's hands of the fundamental means of subsistence, starting from the land, the production of food, and the intergenerational transmission of knowledge and cooperation. Subhead: Capitalism and the Sexual Division of Labor. As this brief history of women and primitive accumulation has shown, the construction of a new patriarchal order, making of women the servants of the male workforce, was a major aspect of capitalist development. On its basis, a new sexual division of labor could be enforced, differentiated not only the tasks that women and men should perform, but their experiences, their lives, their relation to capital, and to other sectors of the working class. Thus, no less than the international division of labor, the sexual division of labor was above all a power relation, a division within the workforce while being an immense boost to capital accumulation. This point must be emphasized given the tendency to attribute the leap capitalism brought about in the productivity of labor only to the specialization of work tasks. In reality, the advantages which the capitalist class derived from the differentiation between agriculture and industrial labor and within industrial labor itself, celebrated in Adam Smith's Ode to Penmaking, pale when compared to those it derived from the degradation of women's work and social position. As I have argued, the power difference between women and men and the concealment of women's unpaid labor under the cover of natural inferiority have enabled capitalism to immensely expand the, quote, unpaid part of the working day and use the, quote, the parenthesis, male wage to accumulate women's labor. In many cases, they have also served to deflect class antagonism into an antagonism between men and women. Thus, primitive accumulation has been above all an accumulation of differences, inequalities, hierarchies, divisions, which have alienated workers from each other and even from themselves. As we have seen, male workers have often been complicitous with this process, as they have tried to maintain their power with respect to capital by devaluing and disciplining women, children, and the populations the capitalist class has colonized. But the power that men have imposed on women by virtue of their access to wage labor and their recognized contribution to capitalist accumulation has been paid at the price of self-alienation and the, quote, primitive disaccumulation of their own individual and collective powers. In the next chapters, I will further examine this disaccumulation process by discussing three key aspects of transition from feudalism to capitalism: the constitution of the proletarian body into a work machine, the persecution of women as witches, and the creation of, quote, savages and, quote, cannibals, both in Europe and the New World.